Cold-blooded bikers mock an old veteran. When his past is revealed, they freeze. The alley behind the bar reeked of spilled beer, motor oil, and bad intentions. Dim streetlights cast long shadows against the cracked pavement, flickering slightly as the evening wind howled through the narrow corridor. A row of Harleys lined up like black stallions, each bearing the insignia of the Iron Fangs, one of the most feared biker gangs in the state. At the center of it all sat an old man, his hands bound tightly behind the wooden chair, a thick rope cutting into his wrists. His back was straight despite his age, and though his face bore the lines of time, his eyes remained sharp, unflinching, unmoved by the men surrounding him. Jack Iron Sullivan, the leader of the gang, cracked his knuckles as he circled the chair, a cruel smirk stretching across his scarred face. He towered over the seated man, looking down at him as though he were nothing more than a worn-out relic of a bygone era. "Tell me, old man," Jack sneered, "what exactly made you think it was a good idea to walk into my bar like you belonged there?" The gang snickered. A few of them flicked their knives open and shut, the metallic clicks echoing ominously. Others leaned in closer, their breath reeking of cheap whiskey and cigarettes. The old man didn't respond. He simply looked at Jack. That single, calm stare made something shift in the air. Jack's smirk faltered for just a second, barely noticeable, but real. "You deaf, Grandpa?" barked Kyle, the youngest in the group, barely 20, desperate to prove himself. He stepped forward and shoved the old man's shoulder. "We asked you a question." Still, the old man said nothing. Jack exhaled sharply, rubbing his jaw. His patience was wearing thin. "All right. Maybe you need a little help remembering your place." He grabbed the old man by the collar, lifting him slightly before slamming him back down. The wooden chair creaked but held firm. The gang roared with laughter as Jack leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You see, in this town, people show respect. And when they don't..." His fingers curled into a tight fist. "We make sure they learn." The old man sighed, not in fear, but in disappointment. He slowly looked around at the bikers, one by one, before locking eyes with Jack again. "You think you know respect?" His voice was deep, gravelly, like a blade scraping against steel. The laughter died down. Jack's expression darkened. "You don't get to ask the questions, old man," he spat, grabbing the veteran's jacket and yanking it open. That was when he saw the scar. A deep, jagged line stretched across the old man's forearm, faint but unmistakable. It was the kind of scar that only came from war. Jack frowned. His fingers hesitated over the rough fabric. One of the other bikers, Lenny, leaned in, narrowing his eyes. "What's that, some prison fight scar?" Kyle scoffed. "Yeah, or maybe he cut himself peeling potatoes in a retirement home." The group burst into laughter again. But Jack wasn't laughing anymore. Something about the scar bothered him. He recognized scars like that. Not from bar fights. Not from street brawls. From men who had seen war. Still, he shook off the thought. "Enough of this," he said, stepping back. "I don't care who you were. What matters is who you are now. And right now, you're nothing but an old fool who doesn't know when to keep his head down." He motioned toward Lenny and Kyle. "Make sure he gets the message." As the two bikers cracked their knuckles and approached, something strange happened. The old man smiled. It wasn't the smile of a man who was afraid. It was the smile of a man who had been in worse situations before. And suddenly, for the first time since this started, Jack felt uneasy. Kyle cracked his knuckles, grinning like a kid about to break a toy in half. He leaned in close, staring into the old man's face, as if waiting to see fear. But there was none. The old man just watched him, those steel-gray eyes completely unfazed, as if Kyle was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Jack stood back, arms crossed, watching his boys work. There was something about this guy that rubbed him the wrong way, but he wasn't about to let some old fossil get under his skin. Kyle smirked. "You don't talk much, huh? That's fine. We don't need you to talk." With a sudden shove, he pushed the old man's chair, making it rock dangerously to one side before slamming back down. The gang laughed. Still, the old man didn't flinch. "Man, this guy's really trying to act tough," Lenny muttered, stepping forward. He reached out and ripped open the old man's coat, exposing his thin, wiry frame. His arms, though aged, were corded with muscle, a lifetime of discipline carved into them. And then they saw them. The scars. Thin, deep, running across his arms and disappearing under his sleeves and collar. Not just one. Several. Jack frowned. "What the hell?" Kyle scoffed. "What, those little scratches? Looks like he got into a fight with a house cat." Lenny laughed. "Or maybe he tripped down the stairs at a retirement home." The gang burst into laughter again, but this time, it was forced. Something felt off. Jack wasn't laughing. He had been in plenty of fights. He'd seen knife wounds, bullet wounds, scars from burns, from broken bottles, from old stab wounds that never quite healed right. But these scars were different. They weren't from bar fights. They weren't from gang wars. These were the kind of scars soldiers carried. Jack narrowed his eyes. "Who the hell are you?" Finally, the old man spoke. "Just a relic," he said simply, his voice steady, unwavering. Jack clenched his jaw. He didn't like this. Kyle, still oblivious to the tension, snorted. "Oh yeah. Well, I think it's time we break that relic into pieces." He raised his fist. And that's when it happened. The old man moved. Not in a rush, not in a panic, just a shift, slight but precise. Kyle's hand stopped in midair. His fingers were inches away from the old man's face, but his entire body was frozen in place. Something changed in the air. The old man wasn't smiling anymore. He wasn't resisting. But something about him was different now. Jack felt it immediately. It was like watching a predator wake up. Kyle's grin faltered. "What the hell are you?" And then, before anyone could blink, the old man turned his head just slightly and locked eyes with Kyle. For the first time, Kyle hesitated. His fingers curled back just a little. The gang stopped laughing. Jack noticed it too. Kyle was suddenly afraid. Jack's stomach twisted. This wasn't normal. Old men weren't supposed to make young, cocky fighters hesitate. Jack felt his instincts screaming at him, but he ignored them. He took a step forward. "You want to play games, Grandpa? That's fine. But you should know something." He leaned in, eyes narrowing. "You're not getting out of here in one piece." The old man just looked at him. Unshaken. Unbothered. Like he'd heard that threat before. Jack suddenly wasn't sure if he had made a mistake. Kyle's fist remained frozen in midair. His breathing had changed, just slightly, but Jack noticed it. The kid's usual cocky bravado had vanished, replaced by something different. Uncertainty. Kyle swallowed hard, his fingers twitching as if debating whether to follow through with the punch or step back. The old man just sat there, watching him. His face was calm, almost indifferent, but his eyes, those sharp, steel-gray eyes, told a different story. They weren't afraid. They weren't angry. They were simply waiting. Jack shifted uneasily. He had seen a lot of men in his life. Killers, fighters, cowards, liars. But this old man, he didn't fit any of those categories. Kyle finally took a step back, muttering under his breath, shaking his head like he was trying to convince himself that it was nothing. Jack's patience snapped. "The hell's wrong with you?" he growled, grabbing Kyle's shoulder and shoving him back toward the old man. "You scared of some wrinkled-up grandpa?" Kyle didn't answer. Lenny, watching the whole thing unfold, decided to take over. He crouched down beside the old man and grabbed his left arm, turning it roughly to examine the scars. "Look at this mess," Lenny snorted. "This ain't from some bar fight." Jack's eyes narrowed. Lenny was right. The scars weren't random, they were clean, deliberate. "Hey, old man," Lenny said, tightening his grip on the veteran's arm. "What happened? Get these in some accident, or was it?" His voice cut off. Jack watched, confused, as Lenny suddenly let go of the arm and took a step back. "Lenny?" Jack frowned. "What the hell's wrong with you?" Lenny didn't answer right away. He just stood there, his face slightly pale. Kyle, still recovering from his own hesitation, scoffed. "What, don't tell me you're scared too?" Lenny exhaled slowly. "I've seen that before," he muttered. Jack's frown deepened. "Seen what before?" Lenny's eyes didn't leave the old man's arm. "These scars, these patterns. I had an uncle, ex-military. These aren't from a street fight, Jack." Silence settled over the alley. The gang, once so eager to humiliate the old man, was no longer laughing. Jack clenched his jaw, ignoring the growing discomfort in his gut. He wasn't about to let some ancient war story spook his crew. "So what if he was military?" Jack muttered, stepping forward. "That was years ago. Look at him, he's old, slow, weak." The old man smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that didn't belong on the face of a man who was truly outmatched. Jack felt his pulse quicken. Lenny shook his head. "Jack, I'm telling you, this guy's got history." Jack ignored him. He refused to be intimidated. "History?" Jack sneered. "Let's find out exactly what kind of history he's got." He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his phone. A few taps later, he had what he was looking for. A reverse image search. A photo popped up. An old, grainy military image. A group of soldiers, standing in formation. In the center, younger but unmistakable, was the old man. Jack's smirk vanished. Kyle and Lenny leaned in, eyes widening. Jack's throat felt dry as he slowly read the words underneath the image. Harold Dawson. U.S. Special Forces. Black Operations Specialist. Elite hand-to-hand combat instructor. Classified missions. Jack's fingers tightened around the phone. The old man hadn't moved. He was still watching. Kyle took a step back. Lenny swallowed hard. For the first time that night, Jack started to feel it. Not just unease. Fear. Jack stared at the phone screen, his breath coming in slow, measured inhales. The old military photo in front of him wasn't just some ordinary squad picture. It was from an elite unit, one of those groups that only existed in whispers. Black operations. Off-the-record missions. Ghosts. And sitting right in the middle of that photo, standing tall, younger but unmistakable, was the old man in front of them. Kyle and Lenny exchanged glances, their earlier arrogance evaporating. The rest of the gang was beginning to sense something was wrong. Jack tightened his grip on the phone. "This doesn't mean anything," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. But his voice lacked the confidence it had before. The old man, Harold Dawson, finally spoke again. "Tell me, Jack," his voice was steady, calm in a way that made Jack even more uneasy. "Have you ever buried a man alive?" The gang froze. The way he said it, like it was a simple question, a casual thought, made it 10 times worse. Jack forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. "You think you're gonna scare me with some more stories, Grandpa?" Harold tilted his head slightly. "No. I don't think you scare easy." He let that hang in the air for a moment before adding. "But your boys?" His eyes flicked to Kyle, then Lenny, then the rest. "They might." Kyle visibly tensed. Lenny swallowed. Jack's jaw clenched. "You're full of crap." Harold shrugged, as if it didn't matter to him whether Jack believed him or not. "You looked up my name, didn't you?" the old man continued. "Did you bother reading past the headlines?" Jack hesitated. He scrolled further down the article. And then he saw it. The section was classified, redacted in places, but the words that were visible hit him like a gut punch. Operation Iron Fawn. Hostage retrieval. Counter-terror tactics. Enemy outpost infiltration. 0 survivors. The Iron Fangs. Jack's head snapped up, staring at the patch on his own leather jacket, the same name. Lenny noticed it too. "Jack," he whispered. "No way. You think?" Jack felt something cold slither down his spine. "You're lying," he hissed, but the words came out weaker than he wanted them to. Harold smiled. "Go ahead. Keep telling yourself that." The gang shifted uneasily, the bravado they had earlier cracking under the weight of what was unfolding. Jack forced himself to keep control. "So what if you were military?" he growled. "That was years ago. You're old now. Weak. I don't care how many bad guys you killed back then, you're nothing now." Harold sighed softly, as if disappointed. "Jack," he said, his voice still steady, calm, but carrying an edge now. "I walked into your bar. Alone. With no weapons. Surrounded by 10 men." He leaned forward just slightly. "Ask yourself why." The gang fell silent. Kyle took another step back. Lenny was already pale, sweat beading on his forehead. Even Jack couldn't ignore the weight of the words. Because Harold was right. What kind of man walks into a den of bikers, alone, without a weapon, without backup? A fool. Or someone who doesn't need backup. Jack's hands curled into fists. He hated this feeling, this nagging doubt, this twisting fear creeping into his gut. He had to end this. Now. He grabbed his knife, flipping it open with a sharp click. "Enough games," he growled. "I don't care who you were. You don't walk into my place and walk back out." The old man didn't react. Jack took a step closer. Then another. The gang held their breath. Harold just sat there, watching. Waiting. And then, before Jack could even blink, the old man moved. And everything changed. Jack barely registered what happened next. 1 second, he was stepping forward, the knife glinting under the alley light. The next, his wrist was twisted at an unnatural angle, pain exploding through his arm. Crack! The knife clattered to the ground. Jack gasped in pain, stumbling back. He hadn't even seen the old man move. Harold Dawson was still sitting, hands tied behind his back. He hadn't even stood up. But somehow, he had taken Jack's weapon away without lifting more than a single finger. Lenny cursed under his breath. Kyle's face went pale. The rest of the gang, once so eager to mock and humiliate the old man, stood frozen. Jack's heart pounded. He stared at Harold, then at his own wrist, then back again. That wasn't possible. "You're fast," Jack growled through gritted teeth. "But you're still tied up. You're not going anywhere." Harold tilted his head slightly. "Am I?" Before Jack could react, the old man flexed his fingers, shifting his wrists behind the chair. The ropes slipped loose. Jack's breath hitched. "What the?" Harold had freed himself. Kyle took a step back. "How the hell?" Harold slowly stood up, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off old stiffness. He stretched his fingers, flexing them one by one. "You boys really don't know who you're dealing with," Harold said quietly. Jack clenched his jaw, trying to regain control. "You think you're some kind of badass? You're nothing but a washed-up old soldier. You're alone. You got no gun. No backup. And there's still 10 of us." Harold's expression didn't change. But his presence did. The way he stood. The way he watched them. It was calm, controlled, unshaken. Jack had seen confidence before. This was something else. This was a man who had nothing to prove because he already knew exactly what he was capable of. "You know," Harold finally said, "I used to train men like you." He let that sink in. Kyle blinked. What? Harold sighed, almost disappointed. Cocky young fighters who think fear is a weapon. Think intimidation is power. But fear only works on the weak. And power? His eyes flicked to Jack. Power is knowing you don't need fear. Jack had had enough. Enough of this cryptic old man crap, he barked. You think I'm scared of you? Harold's gaze didn't waver. No. I think you're scared of what you don't understand. Jack snarled. Screw this. He lunged forward. And Harold moved. Jack didn't even see the first strike. 1 second, he was attacking. The next, Harold sidestepped, his foot twisting in perfect alignment. A sharp, precise strike to Jack's ribcage. Jack staggered. Pain shot through his body, his lungs struggling for air. Then, a second strike. Harold grabbed Jack's collar, twisted, and flipped him. Jack hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from his lungs. The gang erupted into chaos. What the hell? Kyle shouted. Lenny took a step back. No way. Harold dusted off his jacket. That was the slowest takedown I've ever done. I must be getting old. Jack lay gasping on the ground, eyes wide. It wasn't just the pain, it was the realization. This man was dangerous. No, he was something else. Who the hell are you? Jack rasped. Harold glanced down at him. Like I said, he murmured. Just a relic. Silence hung in the air. And for the first time, the gang realized they had made a terrible mistake. Jack lay on the cold pavement, gasping for air. Harold stood over him, his expression unreadable, as if none of this had even required effort. The rest of the gang didn't move. Lenny's hands trembled slightly. Kyle was still frozen in place, his earlier bravado shattered. Jack! Lenny muttered, his voice shaky. I think we should back off. Jack refused to accept this. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself up onto his elbows. You think we're just gonna let you walk away, old man? Harold sighed, rolling his shoulders, like he had all the time in the world. Walk away, he repeated. If I wanted to walk away, I would have done it already. Jack's blood boiled. You arrogant son of a... He lunged again, wild with desperation. Harold barely moved. With one smooth step, he sidestepped the attack, hooked Jack's arm, and used his own momentum against him. Jack's face slammed into the pavement. Thud. He groaned, coughing, blood dripping from his nose. The rest of the gang finally snapped. Get him! Kyle yelled. 3 of them rushed Harold at once. Kyle swung first, a sloppy, reckless punch. Harold caught it midair. With a swift, controlled motion, he twisted Kyle's wrist and dropped him to his knees with one precise move. Kyle screamed. My arm! Lenny grabbed a metal pipe from the ground and swung. Harold ducked. The pipe whooshed through empty air. Before Lenny could react, Harold's elbow slammed into his sternum. Lenny choked, stumbling backward, collapsing against the wall. The last guy, a tall, muscular biker, hesitated for just a second. That was all Harold needed. A sharp kick to the inside of the man's knee brought him down instantly. 3 men on the ground. Jack, barely pushing himself up, watched in horror. Harold hadn't thrown a single wild punch. Every movement had been precise, controlled, effortless. This wasn't just an old soldier. This was something else entirely. Jack's breathing was ragged. He wiped the blood from his lip, desperate to regain control. You think this is over? He growled. Harold looked down at him, unimpressed. You think I care? Jack's hands trembled. Kyle was whimpering on the ground, holding his twisted wrist. Lenny still couldn't breathe properly. The last guy wasn't moving. Jack was alone. He had never felt this helpless before. Why? Jack forced out the words, his throat tight with anger. Why the hell did you come here? Harold took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. I was curious, he admitted. I heard the name Iron Fangs again, after all these years. Wanted to see if you were worth anything. Jack blinked, confused. What the hell are you talking about? Harold crouched down, staring Jack right in the eye. You think you're Iron Fangs? His voice was low, sharp. Boy, I buried the real Iron Fangs decades ago. Jack felt something cold settle in his stomach. He wasn't sure if Harold was speaking figuratively or literally. Harold stood up again, brushing dust from his jacket. This was a waste of time, he muttered. You're not worth the fight. Jack clenched his fists, but his body refused to move. He wanted to fight back. But he knew. He knew if Harold really wanted to end this, he would. And there wouldn't be a damn thing Jack could do about it. The old man turned his back and started walking away. Wait, Jack rasped. Harold paused but didn't turn around. Jack hesitated. He wanted to say something. Ask something. But in the end, he said nothing. Harold didn't wait. He simply walked away, disappearing into the darkness. And none of them tried to stop him. Jack remained on the ground, feeling the weight of something he had never felt before. True power. And for the first time in his life, he had no idea what to do. Jack sat motionless on the cold pavement, his breath shallow, his ribs aching from the impact of Harold's last strike. The air around them was heavy, thick with something unspoken, not just fear, but absolute certainty. They had lost. Kyle groaned somewhere to his left, still clutching his injured wrist. Lenny was propped against the wall, his breathing ragged, while the others remained exactly where they had fallen. None of them made a move to get back up. Harold Dawson, the old man they had mocked, humiliated, and tried to break, stood untouched. His stance was relaxed, casual even, like a man who had simply gone for a stroll and was now ready to be on his way. Jack struggled to understand what had just happened. This wasn't normal. This wasn't how fights went. He had beaten men twice Harold's size, men younger, faster, and stronger. But none of that mattered here. Harold wasn't just an old soldier. He was a man who had lived through things Jack would never understand. Harold finally turned to face them, his expression unreadable. You boys should be careful who you pick a fight with, he said, his voice calm, almost as if he was giving them advice rather than a warning. Jack's lip curled in anger. You think you're better than us? He spat, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. Harold studied him for a long moment. No, he finally said. I think I've already been where you're headed. Jack's jaw tightened, but he had no response. Harold sighed and glanced around the alleyway, as if considering whether or not to say something more. Then he simply shook his head. You're lucky today, he muttered. I'm not the man I used to be. Jack shivered. Not from the cold, but from the implication. Because if this was Harold Dawson at his weakest, Jack didn't even want to imagine what he had been like at his strongest. Harold took a step forward, walking past Jack without a second glance. None of the bikers tried to stop him. Jack wanted to. Every part of his pride screamed at him to say something, to do something, but he couldn't move. Harold paused at the edge of the alley, standing beneath the flickering streetlight. Jack swallowed hard. Who the hell are you? Harold didn't turn around. Someone you were never meant to cross, he said simply. And then he was gone. Just like that. Jack sat there, his body trembling, his mind racing through everything that had just happened. Kyle finally spoke, his voice shaking. What do we do now, Jack? Jack had no answer. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't in control. He had spent years building his reputation, making people fear him. And now, in one night, an old man had taken it all away. Jack clenched his fists. We don't talk about this, he said finally. To anyone. Ever. Kyle hesitated. But Jack. I said we don't talk about it. Jack snapped, his voice louder than he intended. Kyle flinched. Lenny just nodded slowly. Silence. Jack ran a hand through his hair, his heart still hammering in his chest. And then, for the first time since Harold had left, Jack looked down at his own hands. They were still shaking. And he knew, deep down, they wouldn't stop shaking for a long, long time.